We're really excited to have Sara Bushmann here with us today. She is a bee ecologist, a bee biologist, an ecologist, and a teacher. She's currently working at GSA, and I have to say that she was my amazing biology teacher when I went to Liberty School. I feel very lucky to have had her, and very lucky to introduce her tonight to all of you. And maybe a bunch of you, I'm looking at names, probably know her already. But thank you so much, Sara, for joining us, and I will pass it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lander. And should I start my PowerPoint?
Sure.
All right. All right. So thank you. I'm Sara Bushmann, and I'm here today to talk about, whoops, I'm at the very beginning. There we go. Wild bees of Maine. On a regular day in the school year, you'll primarily find me at GSA, where I teach life sciences and health. In the summer, though, I'm often studying and teaching about wild bees. And I've actually always been a teacher. My sophomore year of college, I was hired to help teach the freshman biology course I had just taken. And I've taught in one form or another ever since. But I've always felt that to come close to being the teacher you aspire to be, you need to know your subject well. So I've also worked on advanced degrees and earned a master's from the University of Hawaii, where I studied birdsong. And I finished a PhD from the University of Maine a few years ago, studying wild bees associated with our blueberry crops. So this talk should start with defining what a wild bee is. And I'll first define what a wild bee is by pointing out what it is not.
Hey, Sara, sorry to interrupt. Do you know that your slideshow isn't showing?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Are you seeing, and you're just seeing me?
I'm just seeing you right now, which is great.
I forgot to share my screen. I do this all the time in my job.
No worries.
Let me do that. Here's all I started with was this. So you saw this.
Awesome.
All right. I'll start with this part. What is a wild bee? So I'm going to define what a wild bee is. I'm going to start with saying what it is not. It is not a honeybee. Honeybees are what we would want to call managed bees. Essentially, they are livestock. Think of them as cows with wings. They're managed and kept by a bee farmer. Honeybees are not native to North America. As a species, they most likely originated in North Africa or the Middle East, and they only arrived in North America with European colonists. Any that do exist wild or free, I should say, around here are feral colonies that took off from a hive. So we can say that wild bees are any free living bee that is not managed by people. Most wild bees we find around here are native, but non-native wild bees do occur. Here are two examples. I find the Andrena wilkella, seen on the left, fairly frequently around here. This species came from Europe, probably as a stowaway aboard ship. In terms of time, decades at least, if not in the centuries past. On the other hand, this large megachilid bee, the giant resin bee on the right, was first found in North America in 1997, and it has since spread throughout the Northeast. It's up to an inch long. You will not miss it. If that thing buzzes by you, flies by you, you will know that it just passed by. So it's a pretty dramatic bee, which actually brings up a question, these definitions of native and wild bees. Is a native species that is reared in facilities and deployed by farmers for pollination a wild bee? This is kind of a stumper question when you consider this bumblebee, Bombus impatiens, used fairly frequently by blueberry farmers in Maine. It's a native species, but it's reared in a facility, packaged in a box, and shipped off to farmers. So this picture here is typical what you would find in blueberry fields. This picture was taken from a blueberry field. The bees come in a hive with a box, and the farmers leave them in the field all summer, usually even after blueberry bloom, and they often go to full colony completion of producing queen bees for the next year. And when you find these bees in the field, you cannot tell the difference between the truly wild ones and these managed ones. So there's our wild bee conundrum. And finally, as for defining wild bees, being a biologist, I always like to see the place of an organism in taxonomic scheme. So bees are arthropods, insects in the order Hymenoptera with sawflies, ants, and wasps. Their recent ancestors are predators like the sphecoid wasps. So bees are just wasps that became vegetarians. And they are certainly more peaceable than wasps. Okay, well, we're all here to talk about bees. And why? Why do we care about bees? Why do we devote so much time to learn and study and think about them? I'm sure everyone has their own reasons, but I'll offer two here: economics and gastronomics, food. Looking at our food world, many foods we eat and enjoy are pollinator dependent. That is, an insect pollinator is required to pollinate flowers for fruit and seed to be produced. If there's no insect, and the insects are usually bees, if there's no insect to pollinate the flower, there is no fruit or seed produced. So what do you like to eat? Quite honestly, it's likely pollinator dependent. Here's a crop we all know and love. Pollinator dependent. There are others, are apples, raspberries, cherries, cucumbers, broccoli, cranberries, sunflowers. These are just a handful of the representatives of crops that we need bees to produce. And it would actually be a fairly boring world without bees to pollinate our crops. Not that I have anything against, rice and oats, but they really don't quite have that certain something that blueberries give you, right? That joy of that sweetness that we get from these crops that we're so fond of. And these types of foods, these pollinator dependent crops, are increasing in our diets in worldwide. So these graphs illustrate this trend, and these graphs are for the developed and the developing world. The top graphs are the percent change in production, and the bottom two graphs are the percent change in area under cultivation. The dark dots are crops that are insect dependent, and the open dots are the non-insect dependent crops. So as you can see, globally, the production of insect dependent crops has risen dramatically. So we are increasingly growing and eating foods that require pollination, and the main insect pollinators are bees. Another measure of the value, or what are wild bees worth, is to look at economics. And a study in 2006 found that bee pollination contributes $3.07 billion annually to the US economy. So these are probably reasons enough to spend our time learning about bees. And I think of bees as the small things that make the world go round. So let's look at some bees. There's a prominent bee researcher with the USGS based in Maryland who decided he wanted to find a way to photograph bees so the public can see these amazingly beautiful animals in the same way we researchers see them under a microscope. And so this researcher is Sam Droege, and he makes his work available. You can look him up and you will find tons of his photos on the web. And so I just picked some dramatic ones. Not all of these bees that are on here are found in Maine. Many aren't even found in North America, but they're extremely lovely images. So watch for things like body hairs, often on the hind legs, that are used to transport pollen. Bees pack pollen onto special hairs and to carry back to their nest. And colors in bees can be extremely brilliant and vibrant. And often, oh, here's another brilliant one with dark hairs for carrying pollen. And often what we think of as stripes are actually bands of tightly clumped hairs. So the actual exoskeleton is a solid, say, black or brown, but the stripes are the hair patterns. And these depressions, you can see what look like little puncture marks, little divots in the exoskeleton. These are often used to tell one species from another. So as someone who identifies bees, I need to put them under a microscope. That is, they are usually killed in an ethical way and held in place with a pen. And I look at them under the microscope, and I might have to count the divots on certain parts of the body in order to help determine the species. So some of these species are quite cryptic, and you need to look at very minute characteristics under the microscope. And here's an endangered bumblebee, and we will talk about that one again in a minute. And you can see the typical yellow and black on the bumblebees. Probably these blue from this genus Osmia are my favorite. And here's a bee just totally covered with pollen. All those little yellow balls on it, that yellow stuff is all pollen. And this is a really good illustration of one reason that bees are such good pollinators. So this bee doesn't just have pollen in the special hairs to carry pollen, it's stuck everywhere. And that's because a bee's body is slightly positively charged and pollen is slightly negatively charged. And so when a bee's dancing around on the flower, the pollen just sticks to it. They can then go to the next flower and have tons of pollen just rub off their body as they're collecting pollen and nectar from the next flower. And finally, this one represents a sweat bee. It's not the exact same species as the one common around here, but it's very closely related. And these little green sweat bees, if they're not in your backyard right now, I don't think I've seen one out yet. They will be soon. And so watch in the sun for little flashes of green, and that will be these little bees hitting the small flowers, hawkweeds, or the wild raspberries that'll be coming out soon. And but the warning is these are only a few millimeters long, like 6 or 7 millimeters. So they're really quite small, but they're brilliant and beautiful. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the biology of bees. So we'll talk about sociality and nesting, because those are kind of key biology points. All right. So most bees are what we call solitary. One individual female bee and her nest, and she lays eggs in her nest. Most bees nest in the ground, and most bees live just 1 year. So here are 2 photos of nests that I found in recent years around here. The top left is from a blueberry field, and that would be one of the cellophane bees. She's sticking out of her hole in the ground. And this is just a bare patch between the blueberry plants. And this would have been in May. And in the bottom right there is another solitary bee, but it's got a little twist to it. So there's two holes, and oh, I'll tell you where I found this one. It was very surprising. So bottom of Blue Hill Mountain, just across the street from the parking lot. Not the parking lot to take you up the woods, but the parking lot to take you up that grassy slope. The big parking lot, right in the middle of the walking path. A few years ago, I found this nest. It was the pile of accumulated soil was about an inch high with these two little holes. And as I sat and watched, first one bee takes off, then another bee takes off, then one pops in, then another one takes off, then another one takes off. And so they're solitary bees in that each female is producing her own eggs, but they're obviously doing a communal sharing of this nest, of this tunnel, right? So they're more communal than totally independent. And for the bee up in the upper left-hand corner, to pop back to that one, I will say I saw a whole bunch of nests in the Seaside Cemetery in Blue Hill 2 weeks ago. There may be enough grasses now that they're harder to find. And again, these are solitary, but they do aggregate their nests. So there may be a clump of a few feet by a few feet that have a whole bunch of bees coming in and out. So if you're taking a little stroll through the cemetery there, or in anywhere where you might have some sort of sandy bank, take it real slow and stand for a minute and see if you see faint movement. They circle just a little bit before they find their hole, and then they pop in pretty quick. So keep your eye out for holes bigger than an ant and nice and round. Okay, and so what do their nests look like? So when they go underground, this image is very typical of what you would find as the bees go underground. A central tunnel, lateral tunnel with horizontal offshoots that lead to individual little cells. In each cell, an individual pollen ball with an egg will be laid by the bee. Okay, and you'll never know where you can find a nest. So this nest was on this rock, literally. So if you look at this rock, you see the grasses growing out of it. And what that is there's a crack in the rock that's filled with sand. And out of the sand are growing these grasses. And I would never have found this bee nest except I was sitting on the rock and just sitting there. And I realized that every few minutes, something very loud was going meow right around me and then disappearing. And I thought, okay, I have got to figure out what this is. So after a few attempts, I was able to catch that bee, because when they go into their nest, they want to hide. You know what? They're being very careful. So it took me a while to get that bee, and I realized it was a megachilid bee, a megachile melanophaea. And I was really astounded, because if I had been going to look for a bee nest, I would never have looked for a clump of grass growing out of sand in rocks. And some bees are stem nesters, so they nest above ground. They're not diggers into the ground, and so these nests are often made in the core of old stems. And you can see here some Hoplites bees digging into the core of a stem. And if you open the stem, you're going to find that the bee has closed off a pollen ball and egg in a cell that it constructs. It builds dividers along the stem. So the bee will dig down to the very bottom of the stem, set a pollen ball in place, lay an egg for it, and the pollen's food for when that egg hatches. And then they'll close it off, maybe with plant material or mud, and then they start again. they make another pollen ball and lay an egg and close that one off. And they keep going till they often fill the stem and cap it off. Bees will usually put or make up to 20 trips to flowers for their pollen ball, just one pollen ball and one egg. And this photo down in the bottom right shows a hydrangea stem that's been cut open. And but I've seen that very same species using a sumac stem, a staghorn sumac. So bumblebees are very different. They nest in colonies. They are not solitary bees. They have only one egg layer out of their whole group of several hundred individuals. And that one egg layer is the queen. She lays the eggs, and her workers, once they emerge, they're the ones who gather the pollen and the nectar. So the queens emerge fairly early in the spring, and queen bees are already out around here. They probably do not have their nests yet. She overwintered in a burrow as an adult. She mated last fall. There are no males right now, but so she is carrying sperm from that mating from last fall. And she is one of probably 100, depending on the health of the colony, 100 new queens that her colony produced last summer. And so she finds a place to make a nest. In essence, she finds like any hollow space, an old mouse nest, rock walls. I've seen them in irrigation pipes, you know. And so when she first makes this nest, she's going to put a ball of plant material with wax and some nectar, and she's going to lay her 8 to 10 eggs, which will then, and she has to keep them warm and take care of them, but then they will eventually, those 8 to 10 grow into workers that then take over the pollen and nectar collecting. And from that point forward, the queen doesn't leave her nest. And if you were to open this nest, you would find all these different stages of the bees. You would find the eggs and the larvae and the pupae, and the nectar stores. Nectar and pollen would be stored in these little wax cups that she makes. And she will make only female workers, lay only female worker eggs until later in the summer, when she starts laying male eggs and new queens for next year. And that signals the end of the colony. In the fall, everyone dies. It is the end of the colony, except those new queens. After they mate, they will go dig and find themselves a little underground burrow, and we hope survive the winter. Okay, and then I have to add in these parasitic bees. They're also called cuckoo bees or kleptoparasitic. There's only a few species, but they're real important, in terms of bee diversity. So there's two different kinds. There's the bumblebees and the parasitic solitary bees. Okay, so if a parasitic bumblebee will be a female who wants to steal literally the colony of another female. And so a parasitic bumblebee sneaks into the colony, often kills the resident queen. She might just kind of marginalize the resident queen, kind of beat her up and push her on the side, but she often will kill the resident queen and then start laying her own eggs. And that resident queen's workers are feeding and taking care of her eggs, the new usurper's eggs. And so she steals the colony. And her eggs are all new queens and males. She doesn't produce any workers. All right. And then there's the parasitic solitary bees. And those parasitize other solitary bees that either are ground nesters or stem nesters. And what they do is they wait until a bee leaves her nest. So maybe she's got her pollen ball and she's laid her egg on it, and she may even have sealed this up. Um, but the parasitic bee finds her nest, maybe opens it up, gets inside, and then lays her egg. And sometimes she will then destroy the egg of the bee who placed the pollen ball there in the first place. And other times after her egg hatches, her larvae kill the other bee that would be developing inside that little cell. The larvae of these things have big, sharp mandibles for killing the other bees that might be developing in there. So they steal the pollen ball. They don't collect pollen. As you can see, this one has no hairs with which to carry pollen. She kind of looks like a wasp. And it's because she's lost that ability, because she doesn't get her own pollen. She just thieves. So this genus right here, that's little red ones, I just 3:30 this afternoon, I was looking at the dandelions outside and I saw one of those on the dandelion, and she's not collecting pollen, she was drinking nectar. Okay, so let's see. There are a lot of other really interesting facts about bee biology, and there's many amazing books and many recently written. So, I would really encourage you to browse the shelves of recent science books on bee biology. I did want to kind of put a note out for this one that initially got me started on pollination in general, and bees in particular, and it's an excellent book. And even though it's a 1997, this book is worth your read, and certainly as an introduction to the concept of pollinators. And I would say this book has probably been instrumental in instigating a lot of our research nationally on pollination. Okay. All right, we hear this question a lot. Save the bees. Save the bees? Should I save the bees? Do they need saving? And a lot of times you hear this question in terms of honeybees. Do the honeybees need saving? And we'll probably say yes. We certainly have some stressors that exist in terms of honeybees. One is just the pure stress of being shipped around the country. The colonies, the hives are picked up in California almonds, and shipped to Maine blueberries and then shipped off elsewhere. And that's a stress on a colony. We have, in the only last few decades, there has been a new parasite, the varroa mite. And this parasite is quite harmful to the honeybees, and it can wipe out a colony easily. You can see in the picture down below that little red disc on the back of the bee is one of the mites, and you can see that it's huge. It's small, but in relation to that bee size, that's going to be a lot of mass added to the bee. And so this parasite weakens and potentially even kills adults and larvae. Our bees in North America also are stressed with low genetic diversity, and low genetic diversity usually what follows along with it would be poor immune function and not ability to fight off parasites and pathogens. And also our bees are exposed to pesticides. So often save the bees as honeybees. What about wild bees? Do we need to, think about save the bees for wild bees? And we can see that we have some similar issues with our wild bees. We can see negative impacts with climate change, pesticides, diseases, and habitat loss. So looking up here, I've got some graphs or images to illustrate each of these. If you look up in the right or top left corner, climate change has been shown to impact bees in the sense of shifting plant availability. So the map up in the upper left is the map of plant flower availability on a mountain out in the Rockies. So where the map is in red, they have decreasing what the authors called peak floral diversity. So decreasing floral resources, the blue increasing floral resources, and the gray stable. And what they are able to find, or what these authors found, is that bee abundance, bee range, and even bee features were shifting with the flower shifts. And climate change seems to be the driver for the whole thing. In the right graph, this was a study on looking at pesticides on bumblebee colony growth. So what these people did is they tracked bumblebee colony growth by weighing the bumblebee colony over time. So they have the weight of the bumblebee colony. And they took three types of they took three colonies, or three groups of colonies, I should say. And one group, they fed no pesticides whatsoever. Another group, they fed small doses of a pesticide. If you're familiar with some of the talk about bees, it was a neonicotinoid pesticide, which that class of pesticides has been implicated in being particularly dangerous to bees. And they picked a dose that would be normal if the bee were foraging in a field where the seeds had been treated with neonicotinoids. And then they doubled that dose and called that the high dose. And if you look at the cumulative weight over time, the small dashes are no pesticide. The black line is small doses of pesticide, and the long dashes are the higher dose. And so you can see that all treatments follow the same pattern of an increase with a decrease, and that's normal, decrease as the workers, as you start producing the males and the females. But the pesticide treated colonies never approached the population size or the colony size as the no pesticide treatment. And probably the greatest problem is that the pesticide treated colonies produced 85% fewer queens. So they, by an 85%, had fewer individuals to carry the colony forward in the next generation. And that was probably the biggest, most damaging impact from the pesticide use. And down in the bottom, we see the bumblebees, and back to the bumblebees that are often used around here in the blueberry fields. And so there's evidence that managed bees, both bumblebees and honeybees, bring with them diseases and parasites that can be transferred to wild bees while they all mix it up when they're out on the flowers. And finally, habitat loss is related to bee loss. And it doesn't have to be as dramatic as pavement. Loss of flowers for any reason means loss of food resources. And that will, of course, translate into declining bee abundance. And we do have recorded loss of bee species and bee abundance. As of 2017, a bumblebee is now listed by US Fish and Wildlife as an endangered species. This is Bombus affinis, the rusty-patched bumblebee. Humane surveys used to show the rusty-patched bumblebee as a regular part of the bumblebees foraging in blueberry fields, making up about 30% of all bees caught until the year just about 2000, when they simply disappeared from the blueberry fields. And surveys since then have found no rusty-patched bumblebee in blueberry. This trend holds throughout the country. A study in 2011 demonstrated the decline of rusty patch bumblebee in both range and abundance. So if you look in the map in the upper left-hand corner, the black and gray areas show the known historical range of the species. The yellow circles indicate the different numbers indicate where the authors surveyed for this bee in 2007 and 2009. I should say those gray and black areas, those are historical records. So going back through museum specimens and determining where has this bee been caught. And so gray and black shows that. And the yellow circles show a 2007 to 9 survey. The size of the circle shows how many bees total were caught in that area. And which of those bees were Bombus affinis? If you look out over like Michigan and Wisconsin, those little teeny slivers of orange, that's Bombus affinis. And that was it. That's the only place it was found. So it's from this data that are the basis for listing this, the first North American and first bumblebee to be an official endangered species. I will say in Maine, there is a photograph from about 2009 in the Mid-Coast region that was later determined to be Bombus affinis. And so it's considered, if Maine does have a remnant population of this species, it's most likely in the Mid-Coast area. Let's see. So Lander, how am I doing on time? Or Jake? Are we doing all right?
We are doing just fine. We're at 20 of 5, so you can go ahead and we'll just leave a sliver of time for questions.
All right. So if there is any theme today, it's why save the bees. And I saw that on the list and the chat when we started. It's like, I want to save the bees. It's like, yeah, that's my whole theme. So, I'll ask that question again, why save the bees? So I mentioned earlier, economics and food production. And these are reasons that have to do with us, right? Why we want to save the bees, but that's our own self-interest. But I alluded to another reason in an earlier slide when I put in the parentheses, because they are beautiful, right? Because they exist. So sometimes that's just enough, right? Because they're here. And so, we may not even need to go to what do they do for us, right? And so I wrote here, they're part of complex interactions with other species that form our ecosystems. So I'm going to show you about a recent study, just came out, but don't panic on the graph. What this study is showing is complex interaction between bees and plants in New England specifically. So in this study, they again were looking at historical data from museums and special collections held by universities and whatnot. And they wanted to compare that with current collections, bees in New England found recently. And they paired the bees up with the plants on which the bees were foraging. And so when a bee is foraging, it's looking for food, it's going for the pollen and the nectar. So they called that a bee plant association. And this kind of crazy map summarizes their findings of looking at bee plant associations over time. And what they show here is that, and you don't need to worry about each individual line, sometimes just a generalized view is very helpful here. So the black lines are interactions that have been maintained over time, interactions that the historical record and current record show still exist. Oh, I need to tell you one thing though to help you out here. When you look at this map, the left-hand side of words, they're all given in the scientific nomenclature and the names, but those are the plant species. And if you're a gardener, you probably recognize some of those. The rus, are the sumacs, and there's some goldenrod on there, and the black-eyed Susan, and there's rhododendron and rubus, which would be like wild brambles, like the wild raspberries, spirea, and willow. And so those are some of that. Left-hand column would be all the plants, and the right-hand column are the bee species. Okay, that will probably help. So when you look at the black lines that connect plants to pollinator, those are the interactions between plant and bee that they have found have been persistent for 125 years. The width of the line shows the strength, that is the frequency of the interaction. So the wider the line, the more commonly occurring that interaction is. The red lines indicate lost interactions that were once recorded in history that are no longer recorded. And those interactions were due to disappearing plant or bee species. And the blue lines are interactions like not due to the bee species disappearing or the plant species disappearing, they just didn't record it in contemporary times. So what stands out is that there are powerful red lines on here, and those are the lost interactions due to either a lost plant no longer occurring in the study area, which is most of, this is a New Hampshire group, but they have data from most of southern New England. And so it's the red line is due to either losing that plant species or losing that bee species. All right. So we see that there's many interactions due to these changing landscapes where we're changing the plant species. We seem to be losing native plant species, replacing those with non-native species. In many areas, non-native plants are what is available. So that is what they're using, assuming they can make the switch to the new diet. Okay, although here I'm showing you two native plant species. And these are native ones that bees really like. I really wanted to point this one out. So we've got the fireweed, bumblebees like fireweed, and of course the milkweed. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to reverse the trends, right? How do we reverse these trends of the disconnects between our bees and our plants? One is reduce pesticide use. Another, provide flowering plants for an entire season. Make sure that if we're just managing our yard or a field or a whole farm or a whole nature area, we would want flowers from May through September. Emphasize native plants to help strengthen those historical connections and keep the historical connections. And don't forget nest sites. We don't want to get too quote unquote clean out there, right? So the old crazy bunch of brambles, there's going to be nest sites in there, right? The messy rock wall with some leaf litter, it's going to be providing nest sites. And I thought what I would do, and I think I need to, I'll stop share and then reshare. I want to show you what I think would be a really excellent website for you to start to get some information. And that's this one right here, the Xerces organization. So let's see, I'm going to do this. And this time I'll remember to share my screen. Okay, so here's the Xerces organization. I think they're a great place for you to start if you haven't already. And under resources, let me show you what some of this cool stuff. So if we go to Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, they have got resources by region. So we can say, oh, good, we're up here. Let's find out what's specific to the Northeast. And then look at all of these additional resources. You can figure out how to assess your habitat for pollinator um, accessibility, how to enhance your habitat. What kind of plants should I plant? And they give, here we have native plant profiles and lists, pollinator friendly plants for the Northeast. It's like, okay, this is really excellent. Pesticide protection. Oh, how to manage your habitat. This is a neat one. Identification and monitoring resources. So what are the bumblebees of the Eastern United States? They have a good map to help you identify these bumblebee species. They have, here's rusty patch bumblebee, the endangered species, their pocket identification guide. So if you are walking around and you think, oh, I see it, right? You can have you have a resource here to find out if you really did see it or not. And then they have some of these bee projects, and the Maine Bumblebee Atlas is on here, and they've got great data. I think they're just, I think they've only got about one more year of collecting data, but that's been a great citizen science project for helping determine what bee species exist where in Maine, and that link is on here. And they've got more. So I think it's a great resource here at Xerces, and it's a, like I said, I think it's a super place to start. All right, now I'll go back to my other share. Okay. All right, so here's the final thoughts. And I realize here's a little bit of irony. This is not a native plant. In fact, the last two flowers pictures I have are not native plants. But here's a bee from last summer when I did a survey in Washington County, and a bumblebee. And, you know, just using that non-native thistle. And it's probably getting nectar, because I think that's one of the parasitic males. But so, you know, I don't want to paint too dire a picture, you know, about the bees. Yes, we have some indication that there are some declining species, and some dramatic declines, like the rusty patch bumblebee. Exactly how extensive, how severe, or are we just seeing some fairly natural fluctuations? That question really isn't answered. And so I really think that the key thing is to enjoy your time, you know, educating yourself and others about the bees, and enjoy your backyard. And there's going to be bees out there on those flowers. And like I said, they may only be a few millimeters long, but enjoy watching them, and just sharing that ecosystem with the bees, your own yard. And that's a wonderful thing. So many of these images I took myself, but some I did not. So here's the sources. And here's another non-native plant, and this one's a pain, the bindweed, that seemed to just, the bumblebees were enjoying it one day. So I got some photos. So I do want to thank the Island Heritage Trust and Blue Hill Heritage Trust for hosting this. And I'd be happy to take questions as we have time.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And we have 10 minutes for questions, so that's more than enough time, I think. Lander, there's some great questions in the chat box, but I always love to start, if there's anybody that has their hand raised, we could maybe start there.
Yeah, let me check. Sarah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I thought I saw a hand raised at one point, but it looks like it might be down. So if you'd like to raise your little virtual hand, please feel free to do so, and we will unmute you so you can ask Sarah your question yourself. But maybe we'll get started in the chat box. Jake, do we want to start with the farthest question back? I see one here from Susan. If the blueberry farmers keep bees in boxes, do those bees make nests in the blueberry fields?
Their nests are in those boxes. And so they come with a queen. When they order them, they get a queen, and they have, I forget the number, a certain number of workers that are there. So it's already an up and going colony. And when the farmer puts the box in the field, they open the little door, and they've got worker bees coming and going. The one thing that those bees do is, if the farmer keeps it in the field for the entire summer and they produce queens, potentially those queens are going to overwinter. And so potentially there is a new colony next year started from the commercial colony from the year before. We don't know, though, how far the queen might nest from her own, how far her overwintering nest may be from where she was reared. So whether she's in that exact same field again, I don't know.
Well, thanks, Sarah. We do have a hand up now. So maybe I will unmute Eileen, I think it is. If you would like to ask your question. I know sometimes raising the hand is an accident that just happened. So if that happened, no worries. But if you'd like to ask your question, I think you can do so now. We could move on to another chat box question, maybe, Jake, and then we could come back if Eileen still has a question.
All right, here is a good one. Leslie asked if the solitary bees are also sharing sperm and sperm donors.
Whoa, I don't think so. I don't think it's known. I think my guess is multiple matings are rare, but I cannot promise you that that is correct. It's a great question.
I thought that was a good question.
There's another question from Marcia. Are those bees that you saw in the seaside cemetery roughly housefly sized?
Bigger. Yeah, so double the size of a housefly. And they definitely fly differently. So if you spend just a little bit of time, you'll be able to tell the difference between the way a bee flies and the way a fly flies, and they really are distinctive. And you'll get it in 20 minutes of watching.
Cool.
We have another question about exotic plants and pollination. So I thought this was interesting. Sheila asked, and I'm gonna summarize a little bit here. If the pollen and nectar produced by exotic plants is adequate for native insects, or if it has proper nutrition for the pollinators.
Yeah,
that's a great question.
It is a great question, and in some plants the answer is going to be yes, and in some plants the answer is going to be no. And there is just, and I literally saw that this paper came out yesterday, and I haven't had a chance to read it. Somebody has recently looked at nurseries, and so nurseries have these the plants that have been bred for these, crazy double flowers and these bright colors. And I believe the upshot was that the bee visitation was no different between those and say their wild type. But in terms of nutrition, I think it's going to vary from plant to plant. And I believe some will be found to be not as nutritious and some just fine.
David is wondering, do parasitic bumblebees parasitize the same species?
Oh, yeah, probably. There are, and this is a good point, there are some that are associated with some species. So a commonly found, or one that I find commonly when I've done some surveys on islands, I find this parasitic bumblebee species commonly, and it is known to parasitize, 3 or 4 different species. Now, the Bombus affinis, the endangered bumblebee, had a parasitic species that was only known to parasitize Bombus affinis, and that parasitic species also seems to be gone. That it has disappeared with the Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee.
So we have a question about bumblebees specifically. Let's see, do honeybees provide high fructose for them? Let's see, honeybee pollination businesses now take most of all of their bees' honey and instead provide high fructose for them. That's interesting. It was believed that the fructose does not provide the health protection that the honey does. Is there more recent research done that this is true?
And that I don't know. I don't get a lot of honeybee reading in, but I will can guarantee that the honey is going to have a lot more nutrients than high fructose corn syrup. That seems to be a given. For sure.
No.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That makes sense. Sarah, we have a question. Are all bees pollinators?
No, not the parasitic. Well, yeah, the parasitic ones would be accidentally, if they just happen to accidentally get a little pollen stuck on them, but they don't even have many hairs. So definitely not the parasitic ones. And some bees will not be pollinators or very efficient pollinators on some flowers, because some bees are going to flowers just for nectar. And they may not be a pollen collector on that flower. And again, so their pollination would just be like pure luck if they land on another flower and happen to drop some pollen on accident.
Okay.
And Sarah, Tina asked the same question I did. She put a little hand emoji and said, what do you personally plant in your garden to attract or help the bees?
So, yeah, that's a great question. And I just moved. So I can't tell you what I'm planting right here. I'll tell you what I did at my old house. So my old house had a big field, and very purposefully over multiple years, we managed the fields for maximizing wildflowers. We put the fields into different zones, and each zone got mowed one year, but not every zone was mowed every year. So there was always a chunk of the several acres. There was always a chunk that was in a second and possibly third year growth. And that helped bring out the wildflowers. We also mowed down, we were very careful to mow down that invasive loosestrife. All of a sudden the name of the loosestrife is escaping me, but we were careful to mow down the invasives, and we were very careful to cultivate the milkweeds and the goldenrods. And so, and the dogbane is also, the bumblebees really like the dogbane. So what we did is, through a mowing regime, kind of a purposeful mowing, we made strips that were very bee-friendly strips with wildflowers. And I hope that answers the question.
That's so cool. Thank you, Sarah. People have so many questions for you. Thank you, everyone in the audience. We are at 5. Sarah, is it okay if we take a few more questions before we sign up for the night? Okay. So John is asking, why aren't Apis, and I'm not going to be able to say this correctly, but Apis mellifera and Apis crana on your bee plant sharing chart?
On the bee plant sharing chart. So the research chart, or I'm not sure. Probably, if I'm thinking the chart you're thinking of, it's because it really was looking at wild bees, very specifically wild and native. So I would assume that that's why they're not on there.
Got it.
And Jen was asking if she could maybe send a picture of an unidentified bush, because in their garden the bees were all over it. So
Oh
maybe
yeah, that'd be
we
fun.
could bridge the gap for you too, and there could be some helpful identification there.
Yes, and you know, I should have put my email. I am available at George Stevens Academy, so anyone can email me through that email. No problem.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who's registered, and if you don't mind, I'll put your email
That's fine.
there. Okay.
And I see one thing about trees. Should I real quick answer that one?
Absolutely. Answer any question you would like.
Yeah, so willows are great for the really early bees, and maples, wild cherry, not native, but apple. It's wonderful for bees. Um, um, so yeah, those would be great ones.
Sarah, we had a question about, this is a bee behavior question. Let's see. Eileen was wondering if a bee is spinning around near the ground and then shooting up in alternating feet, and then it seems rising back down. What might that mean? What might that behavior be?
Okay, oh, there I see it. Spinning and raising the foot. If it were coming back down, if it were on the ground, not on a plant, and if it were coming back down to the ground, I would assume if it's a bumblebee, it's looking for a nest site. It's a queen looking for a nest. And if it's not a bumblebee, it may very well have a nest down there. I believe what's being described there is probably the behavior you see of the orientation of kind of getting the nest image in your head and kind of spinning around and before taking off. I believe that's right. Oh, it was on cement. Oh no. Well, there goes that one. So yeah, that would be interesting to know what it was doing there. It's not impossible. It was totally disoriented.
Thanks, Sarah. We have a hand up, and so Sheila, I think you've asked to speak, so I'm going to allow you to talk if you would like to. I think you just have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to share, I heard or saw one of the questions, and it was being answered about what plants should be grown, what would be helpful. There's a fellow named Doug Tallamy. Many of the people listening might know about him, but if a person doesn't, he has written or co-authored at least 3 books. His career is studying insects, and he branched out into how do you protect native insects by studying the plants they eat, and then he's trying to educate basically the citizens as to how they can support native insects. And 3 of the titles, her first one was Bringing Nature Home, and then there's The Living Landscape, and then Nature's Best Hope. I just wanted to get that out there. Thank you. And thank you very much.
Oh yeah, well, thank you. And you know, there are so many wonderful resources, and so having another one stated is great. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. I will add those ideas to our follow-up email as well for folks. All right. Jake, did you see any other questions in the chat box, or?
Lots of praise. I was combing through, and Sarah, I think you can see the chat box too, but there is a lot of praise for you there, so I want to draw attention to that. I think we answered the question about the aphids. There was a mention of the book, and then we answered the question about the trees, I think, too. So it seems to me that we got to everything. And maybe if Leonard and I missed one, we can ask folks to reach out to Sarah directly, and then we can share the follow-up information as well.
That sounds great.
And there's one statement about Schoodic Institute encouraging everyone to share bee photos with iNaturalist. Yeah,
Very
yeah, that's an excellent recommendation. Thank you.
I will include that in the follow-up email as well as the book that Sarah mentioned in her talk.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate your time too.
Yes.
All right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us, and you will get a follow-up email soon.
Have a good night.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.